Forcible transfers, forced evictions and demolitions, discrimination, unlawful killings and excessive use of force. No freedom of movement, arbitrary detention, torture and other ill treatment. Palestinians are facing these types of treatment every day. In addition to all these crimes, their freedom of movement is also restricted due to the illegal air, land and sea blockade of the Gaza Strip. This restriction has a devastating impact on human rights, and all these acts are nothing other than crimes of persecution and apartheid against Palestinians. All of a sudden, in the depth of the night, Israeli forces start demolishing Palestinian residential and livelihood structures in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Palestinians are trying to resist unnecessary and excessive force, but without success, as the Israeli military continues to displace hundreds of people.
يا جماعة يلا ما بكره الظلم والظالم، بكره اللي بيكفر الظلم ويسكت عليه.
يا ساتر، ايش هاد؟
خدي جوا، خدي جوا. بسيطة كلبة، بسيطة.
الباب بعينك. الو.
ايش حلو؟
احمد وينك؟
مالك؟ ايش في؟
هدول الكلاب رجعوا مرة ثانية، هيهم عند عمي ابو ناجي.
طب يلا هيني جاي.
طيب بسرعة.
يلا سلام.
ماشي سلام.
الو.
سعاد، كيفكم انتم مناح؟ عمي وخالتي مناح؟
خنازير هدول،
مش مخليني اطلع من الدار.
نقلوا البيت وكسروا غرفة النوم الجديدة، الله ياخذها.
بسيطة يا اختي بسيطة. هاي احمد جاي بالطريق، بس انتوا ديروا بالكم.
بهونها الله، وانتوا ديروا بالكم على الولاد.
طيب ماشي سلام.
يلا سلام.
مع السلامة. احنا لايف. مرحبا يا جماعة. أصدقائي، زي ما أنتم شايفين، عاود جنود الاحتلال قدومهم إلى حي الشيخ جراح، محاولة منهم إخراجنا من بيوتنا عشان المستوطنين ياخذوها منا. حاليا الكلاب موجودين عند جيران. أحمد
اطلع برا يا ابن الكلب، اطلع برا.
هذا جزء بسيط من حياتنا اليومية اللي بنعيشها كل يوم.
أنا
قطعوا النت، الله يقطعهم.
اسمعيني بزبوطش هيك. لازم نجيب الأولاد وتوديهم عند دار سيدهم، وأنا بضل عند دار عمي أبو ناجي.
ماشي يلا.
تعالي يابا، تعالي.
Israeli forces bring destruction not only to Gaza, but also to the hearts of Palestinian families as it continues its deadly air campaigns. Our following infographic explains the plight of Gaza's children. Israel mounted airstrikes in the Gaza Strip on Wednesday, the first since the end of 11 days of cross-border fighting last month.
Israel launched airstrikes in Gaza on Wednesday. This flare-up is a first test for Israel's new government after a tentative ceasefire stopped 11 days of cross-border fighting last month. A Hamas spokesman, confirming the Israeli attacks, said Palestinians would continue to pursue their, quote, brave resistance and defend their rights and sacred sites in Jerusalem. Only hours before the strikes, there was an Israeli nationalist march in East Jerusalem that drew threats from Hamas. Israel, which annexed East Jerusalem after a 1967 war, regards all of Jerusalem as its capital. However, Palestinians want East Jerusalem to be the capital of a future state that would include Gaza and the West Bank. Thousands of flag-waving Israelis congregated around the Damascus Gate in Jerusalem's Old City. Israel has recently beefed up its Iron Dome anti-missile system in anticipation of possible rocket attacks from Gaza. But as marchers began to disperse after nightfall, there was still no sign of rocket fire. An earlier march in May was diverted away from the Damascus Gate. However, that wasn't enough to discourage Hamas from firing rockets toward Jerusalem, an action that seemingly sparked last month's violence.
And I'm joined from London in England by Ahmed El-Turk, who's the director of the Arab Lawyer Platform. Mr. El-Turk, thank you for joining us here today on The Edge. We've just been watching scenes of the Zionist parade in East Jerusalem, yesterday, and of course that sparked off yet more attacks from Israel into Gaza as Gaza protested this horrible activity that was taking place. Quite rightly, they protested. What do you make of this coming so soon after the new government has been put in place? Is this a sign of things to come with Bennett leading the roost?
Thank you for receiving me. Actually, the current Israeli government is a hybrid creature. It consists of parties with conflicting agendas. As we know, after the war in Gaza, a month ago, and 11 days of continuous attacking civilians and homes and towers of media, civilians, many Palestinians were killed and injured. 2 days ago, Israel launched an air raid on the Gaza Strip after Palestinians group in the besieged enclave sent flammable balloons, which caused a number of places in open fields in settlement near Gaza. As we know, actually, the Israelis, the extremists, actually, they were insisting on what is they called the March of the Flags, which marks the anniversary of Israel, 1967, of the occupation of the city Eastern Part, and came as the tension remained high over the Israelis' planned post-displacement of the Palestinian families in Sheikh Jarrah. The Israelis continues attacking the Palestinians, the civilians. Now, all of this we know is that Israel, they hold out that they are a superpower in the region, in the Middle East. But in the recently, we just noticed that this superpower, as they want to hold out, besieged, dwarfed and belittled to be just a little regime who is trying to secure the safety and the security of the marsh. Israel, it's not any longer the superpower whom they claim that is they are protecting their own people and the Palestinians. No, Israelis, they are aggressive. They've attacked the Palestinians in Gaza, and as well those whom they call them as their own citizens, the Palestinians whom they are under the Israeli occupation. Israel forced them to hold the Israeli citizenship, and they call them an Israeli citizens, but despite that, they treat them as second-class citizens. They treat them in very bad way, and the best example of that, what is happening in Sheikh Jarrah. Innocent Palestinians whom they lived in that region before the existence of the occupation, more than 73 years, the Palestinians are living in Sheikh Jarrah, and the Israelis, the settlers, they want to uproot them from their home, whom they left there 3 or 4 or 5 generations. This is the occupation. This is the dirty face of the aggression which is presented these days.
Now, occupation is in itself, so we were reminded by several people speaking at the recent United Nations emergency meeting, is a war crime in itself to occupy territory like this is illegal, and yet it continues. And Sheikh Jarrah, as you say, is just one example of the many different places where occupation is going across the whole of the Palestinian territories, the villages being uprooted and so on and so forth. But also, one development, if you like, today is that an autistic young man was fatally shot last year, and he was Ayad Halak was shot a year ago on the 30th of May. And the police officer who shot him with live rounds, unarmed man, has been charged now with manslaughter. It's very unusual for Israeli forces to come under any criticism, let alone any prosecution for the criminal acts that they're doing. Is that right?
This time, actually, the situation is completely different than what happened in the past. Every time we witness that is in 1948, 1967, 1973, every time when the Israelis actually launched a war against the Arabs, they occupied certain lands, and after that, they started to negotiate as if they are in control. This time, for the first time, Israelis find themselves in very difficult situation. Imagine Israel, for this first time, they regret attacking one of the towers which consists of the Western media. Now we can see that the International Criminal Court is chasing the Israelis against their attacks. Israel, they arrest sometimes some individuals whom they claim that they want to send them to the court. But few days or few weeks after that, they would release them either on bail or they were acquitted. But what we are witnessing these days, actually, the balance and the feeling of the people around the world, it is completely different. When we witness members of the American politicians and in the Western community stand up together against the Israeli aggression against the Palestinians, this is, I believe, it is unprecedented. Now the Israelis, they are considering, they are taking serious the next step of the ICC, because Israel, in the end, they have to answer for the war against humanity and for the ethnic cleansing against the innocent Palestinians. They are uprooting the innocent Palestinians from their homeland. I don't think actually Israel any longer in a position where they can go and say that is, we have the smartest army, we have an ethical army. Not at all. This war and these attacks show the real ugly face of the occupation by killing kids, elderly people, and as you said, some of them actually they have as well learning or other medical difficulties.
Ahmed Eltuk, thank you for joining us today and giving us giving your perspective. Thank you for joining us on The Edge. And I'm now joined on the phone from Istanbul by Hassan Ben Imran, who's a board member of Law for Palestine. Hassan, thank you for joining us again here today on The Edge.
Thank you, Andy.
We've just been discussing the marches that went through Jerusalem by the Zionist groups, the far-right extremists in Israel, as well as the ongoing lawlessness against Palestinians in East Jerusalem, which of course is impinging on the Gaza Strip. What do you make of the repercussions from that following the protests in Gaza against this march? Israel sent rockets once again into Gaza for the first time since the ceasefire after the short 11-day series of attacks. What do you make of that?
Exactly as I was listening to the description of the speaker before me, I think Israel has realized that its actions will go unpunished. That's the perception that Israeli leaders are having right now. And this was manifested in the choices in making the new government, the new cabinet, that has shifted in a very scaring way to the far right. You're having Naftali Bennett, someone who was bragging that he killed many Arabs, and he said that there is absolutely no problem with that, is now in charge of Israel. Unfortunately, it seems that we are going to see Netanyahu as a moderate after witnessing this current cabinet. So when it comes to the actions in Sheikh Jarrah and Gaza, and the basically breaching the ceasefire in Gaza, and what is continuing in Sheikh Jarrah and the march, the flags march, organized by the extremist groups, Israel realizes that basically there is no issue in continuing these actions. There is no one to stop them and remind them that they are supposed to like observe their own actions, even though that the international community's requests are quite minimal and simple. Nobody, unfortunately, it's the case. The international community is asking Israel to restrain its actions, is asking Israel to reduce the scale of the flags march organized by extremist groups, disregarding the fact that Israel is illegally occupying East Jerusalem, including Sheikh Jarrah, including the areas where the arenas where the march is going through. So basically, the root cause of the issue is that Israel is occupying somewhere it should not be occupying in the first place. And yet, the calls that we are listening to right now are simply asking Israel to stop its actions. And nobody is even talking to Israel that it has to withdraw its army from East Jerusalem, and it has to stop the illegal settlements, and it has to stop its very provoking actions that are happening. Sadly, it's the case.
Now, as you say, Naftali Bennett has a history of promoting occupation and new settlements. Yair Lapid, who's going to be the foreign minister, I believe, for the next 2 years before he becomes, if the coalition continues, before he becomes prime minister 2 years later, is slightly more moderate, but and also more in favour of a two-state solution. Do you see that this coalition will last that long, or is the uncertainty from the Israeli side going to continue and possibly cause more problems for Palestinians as a result?
If you look at the situation, at the nature of the coalition in Israel, it looks like anything but harmonious and compatible. It's mainly a coalition formed to bring down Netanyahu. There is great doubt, huge doubt, that this cabinet can continue until Lapid becomes the prime minister. I mean, for 2 years. My personal opinion is that such a coalition is simply made for the purpose of bringing down Netanyahu. But there are no signs that this coalition can survive for long. But the sad truth is that, as far as the Palestinians are concerned, that no matter who sits in the cabinet, it's getting from bad to worse, unfortunately. Even when the left was ruling Israel, when Olmert was there, settlements were expanding. Settlements never stopped. But simply, the Israeli left is more attentive to international image of Israel. The left cares about how Israel looks like in the Human Rights Council and the United Nations, while the far right simply disregards this as a factor, and they take more extreme measures than the Israeli left. So what I can see is, even if this government is ousted, is brought down by whatever changes that happen within the composition, the makeup of the coalition, what's most likely is that an even more far-right leader is going to appear. Just simply, if we read the history of Naftali Bennett, we will, 10 years from now, nobody would imagine that someone with the career and with the profile of Naftali Bennett could become a prime minister in Israel. Someone as extremist as him, someone as disregarding of international laws as him would become a prime minister in Israel. That's a very alarming sign, actually.
Absolutely. Hassan, if you can stay with us, I'm also joined live from Chilliwack in Canada by Colter Lewis, who's a PhD candidate in Palestine studies at the University of Exeter. Coulter, thank you for joining us here today on The Edge.
Thanks for having me.
There's, as we've just been discussing, the situation across all of the Palestinian territories are one in which the pressure is continuing to build. We recently had the 11 days of Israeli airstrikes into Gaza, but that's just a symptom of a long and very extreme problem. What do you think the reaction of the Palestinians will be to the new government and this first in the first days of the new government, the march of the flags that stirred up emotions once again?
Well, in terms of Gaza, you have, of course, the immediate cause of the recent escalation in violence, being that march, the March of the Flags. But you also have the sort of more broader context of what Israel has done to Gaza over the past several years. Namely, that Israel has now, for the past decade, yes.
Sorry, we can hear you.
Yes.
Well, you can continue. We can hear you.
That Israel has, for the past decade now, subjected the people of Palestine in Gaza to a crippling siege, which has rendered 97% of the drinking water unfit for human consumption, so that now waterborne diseases are the leading cause of child mortality in Gaza. The proximate cause of which, as well, is that crippling blockade that Israel has put in place. All of which is to say that when Palestinians in Gaza respond to this March of the Flags by firing into Israel or releasing into Israel incendiary balloons, the idea that this would justify in any way Israel's airstrikes against Gaza, as it just did again, is patently ridiculous. In fact, laughable were not the consequences for the people of Gaza so severe.
Well, you bring up some very important points there, and the last one, especially the reaction by the Israelis to anything that the Palestinians do is much harsher in return, where you have unarmed protesters being shot by live bullets. You have homemade incendiary devices being fired by. Being returned by First World munitions. What do you think the world community needs to say about this sort of disproportionate reaction?
Well, I think the important thing at the current moment is for the international community to keep up pressure. It's important to remember that Israel suffered, to a certain extent, a strategic defeat. I'd like to be careful about saying this. I don't want to say that the Palestinians won a strategic victory. Certainly the 250 plus Palestinians who lost their lives in the recent 11-day conflict didn't win a strategic victory. Nevertheless, Israel failed to accomplish its objectives in that 11-day conflict. It set about, as its military claimed, to destroy the tunnel network underneath Gaza, the Hamas tunnel network. It set about to destroy Hamas's rocket launching network within Gaza. And neither of those things were accomplished. And so after 11 days, Israel had to cut its assault short. Although it appeared for a moment to be gearing up for a ground invasion, it decided against it. And this was, to a significant extent, in my analysis, due to international pressure, in particular due to the pressure from the Biden administration. Although the Biden administration publicly repeated that well-known mantra of the U.S. administration, that Israel has its right to defend itself, there appeared to be a considerable amount of evidence that behind the scenes, Biden, who is much more concerned with his domestic agenda and does not want to be dragged into Israeli ventures in the Middle East, was applying a certain amount of pressure on Netanyahu to hold off on a ground invasion and to cut that assault short. And so Israel has suffered something of a strategic defeat, and certainly this current government will be looking to the future for a way to restore what the Israeli military commonly calls its deterrence capacity, namely the Palestinian fear of Israel, to cut the Palestinians down to size, as the IDF often fondly refers to it as mowing the lawn, so that they know their place and don't challenge the miserable status quo that's been imposed on the Palestinian people in Gaza for now over a decade.
Absolutely. Coulter, if you'll stay with us, we're also joined by Elif Shelinchelik, who's a political analyst in London. Welcome to The Edge, Elif. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for your... Thank you.
If you would stay with us, we're just going to have a look at an infographic together. Since the 1970s, discussions have been held to find a solution to the never-ending Palestinian-Israeli tensions. What proposals have been put forward? This infographic explains. I want to return to Hassan first and just to ask you before you leave us. The situation in Gaza has deteriorated immensely, as we saw last month with the 11-day rocket barrage from Israel. Already very difficult circumstances with large parts of Gaza still being reconstructed after the previous rounds of attacks. As Coulter brought up, the water and electricity situation in Gaza is still terrible. The only COVID-19 hospital and the top doctors were wiped out and killed. What is the situation and what is the international community doing to bring some breath of fresh air to Gaza at this time?
Yep. I think in answering this, we should keep in mind that many of what has been destroyed in 2014, in the aggression on Gaza in 2014, is yet to be rebuilt. Of course, something happened, some construction happened, reconstruction happened, but much of what has been destroyed in 2014 was not even reconstructed. So you can imagine how dire the situation is right now. So if what has been destroyed like 8 years ago, and in many other attacks, singular attacks here and there that happened between the two aggressions. So we can imagine the dire humanitarian situation right now in Gaza. The COVID-19 basically is something that Gaza is incapable of handling on its own. If you look at the resources of the authorities there, if you look at the humanitarian and the health situation in Gaza, basically when you speak with colleagues and friends in Gaza, COVID-19 is the last thing they speak about. Simply, there is no capacity, medical capacity to handle the situations that are coming, and they're trying to pay more attention to the casualties of the war. So in short, the situation is very unpromising, it's very dangerous. The United Nations did already say that by 2020 Gaza will be uninhabitable, and now we're in 2021 with the latest aggression, with the latest bombing. The situation in Gaza is something that nobody would like to imagine. It's as bad as it is. The international community needs to provide more assistance, more help for Gaza, and exert more pressure on Israel to allow the arrival of this aid, medical aid and humanitarian aid into Gaza. Of course, Gaza is not okay with facilitating this with the pretext that these materials could be used for military purposes. Even though, regardless of whether this is true or not, there is nothing that justifies preventing people whose houses, whose homes have been destroyed, not to rebuild their houses. Those who need urgent medical supplies, not to have these medical supplies.
Absolutely. Well, Hassan Ben Imran, thank you so much for joining us today on The Edge and bringing us up to date with your perspective on Gaza. Thank you. Elif, let me come to you. Thank you for joining us once again. The situation across the whole of the Palestinian territories is something which we're trying to help people understand how difficult it is for Palestinians just to live an ordinary life, let alone the devastation that's been wrought on them because of bombardments and so on and so forth. We know about the situation in Sheikh Jarrah with the evictions still looming over their heads. But that's just one example of the way daily life in any part of the Palestinian territories, East Jerusalem, West Bank, Gaza, is being brought to a standstill. What can you tell us about how else Palestinians are being prevented from moving forward and living what you and I recognise as an ordinary life?
Yeah, as our colleagues from Gaza, they reported this week, Israeli aircraft bombed a site in Mayan area. It is the south of Han Yunus in Gaza City. And those kind of bombardment caused a lot of material damage, again, like in Sheikh last May. So, for example, a Palestinian teenager died today after being shot by Israeli troops in occupied West Bank. And Israel continues, as you highlighted, Israel continues to discriminate against Palestinian citizens of Israel in the areas of planning, budget allocations, and policing and political participation as well. But that's clear that Palestinians will continue to pursue their brave resistance and defend their rights and sacred sites in Jerusalem. Palestine belongs to the Arabs in the same sense that England, I'm joining today from London, for example, like London belongs to the English, or France, Paris belongs to the France. So it is wrong and inhuman to impose the Jews on the Arabs. What is going on in Palestine today cannot be justified by any moral code of conduct. And surely it will be a crime against humanity to reduce the proud Arabs so that Palestine can be restored to Jews partly and also as well their national home. So today, as Human Rights Watch said today, while Israel has legitimate security concerns, of course, those concerns do not justify its actions in denying Palestinian building permits in many areas, like Gaza, and revoking Palestinian residency rights, and also those residency areas privately owned by Palestinians, their own land. So Israeli policies they are using security as a pretext to advance demographic objectives of prioritizing Israeli Jews over Palestinians, most severely in West Bank and Gaza. Mm-hmm. So while I am doing my research on the relationship between religion and Israel, religion and state in Israel, what I found, I'm not a lawyer, but what I found from my research, that Israel's chronic instability, to what I believe is its core. Unlike most countries, Israel does not have a constitution. Yes, as you know, constitutions constrain the power of governments by defining in precise terms who has what rights form the base of legal decisions, and how political power is dispersed among institutions. But Israel is governed by a changeable, very, very changeable.
And indeed, Israel is totally unstable. Even though it's only 6 million people, they can't they find it difficult to pull a government together, even after 4 elections. Coulter, I want to ask you, the situation has been described as something as an apartheid regime against the Palestinians. The Palestinians have been resisting against this. Why is it, do you think, that although they've made great demonstrations over the years, both inside the Palestinian territories and outside, why haven't they succeeded in bringing their cause home?
I think to date it's pretty straightforward. Israel is the regional superpower, and it's backed by the world superpower, namely the United States. And the Palestinians, by contrast, are a people with no standing military, who are struggling for their rights with no or limited arms. Recently, we've seen something of a sea change in international public opinion. If you compare, for example, 2018, when Palestinians were marching during the Great March of Return in Gaza to try and end that suffocating blockade imposed upon them by the State of Israel, there was very limited international solidarity with that movement. If you compare it to today, Palestinians after the recent assault on Gaza witnessed a massive upswell in support for their cause around the globe, particularly in Western countries. In London, for example, there was the largest demonstration on behalf of Palestine in the course of British history. New York, too, saw dozens and dozens of pro-Palestinian demonstrations, those that dwarfed what little demonstrators came out in support of the State of Israel. And so if Palestinians can find it within themselves to heal their current factional divides, to unite in my opinion, in a strategy of nonviolent resistance, and to leverage the international support that has grown for their cause in recent times, there are still opportunities to perhaps lift that blockade of Gaza, that illegal and inhuman blockade, and perhaps in the long term to achieve some kind of liberation for the Palestinian people.
Well, let's certainly hope so. Coulter, thank you so much for joining us here today on The Edge. We've enjoyed speaking with you. Thank you. Elif, I want to continue with the idea that Coulter was just bringing up the international support, the protests and the reactions, particularly following the recent Israeli bombardments. There has definitely been a change, and I understand that in the United Kingdom that a petition of over 400,000 people has been delivered to Parliament. So why do you think it is, or how do you think it is that people in the United Kingdom and in other countries are now beginning to change their understanding and beginning to give different forms of support? And will this give benefits?
Yeah, well, because people, civilians, they realize that Big Brother is watching them. Big tech companies like Facebook, like Google, are working overtime to erase criticism of Israel from their influential platforms. So people, they realize that. So that's why they started the demonstration, and they are supporting Palestinian rights, actually, because especially due to the COVID-19, they stuck at their homes, and this Palestinian issue really, it's a big drive for them, and it raised awareness really, and people, they don't need to be their allies, actually, just they want to. They are just witnessing human rights violations and Israel's war crimes. So that's why, they bombarded our colleagues, ALJAZZAR's, for example, big building. They are bombarding press. They are bombarding, human rights organizations' buildings in Gaza, in Palestine. So that's why those kind of restrictions, those kind of attacks on the civilians really makes other people very stressful, under stress. So that's why that kind of widespread criticism of the move we can see because of the restrictions, actually.
What more can people in the United Kingdom or the United States do to help the Palestinians? Is it about raising the awareness of the nature of apartheid there, in the same way that the demonstrations against South Africa in the 1980s brought a great change to that country? Is that what needs to be done?
Yeah, that's really good example, apartheid, and also the example of Mandela. I trust the generation. This new generation has already proved that they will not give up the fight until the oppression of Palestinian people is over. And, you know, in the face of Israel's most recent assault, you know, on their rights and lives in occupied East Jerusalem and Gaza, the Palestinians not only demonstrated unprecedented courage and unity, also embarked on a landmark general strike, the first in decades, and with the full support of their nation. So other communities like British communities or other communities, United States, they also realize that Palestinian belongs to the Palestinian people, and they realize that there is no political will, there is no desire. On the background, it is Israel expanding and it is Israel taking the land. So they realize that those people, those innocent civilians, they need their school, they need their clean water. So can you imagine that we are still talking about how to justify the injustice, how to legitimize the occupation? So Israel can be stopped. People realize that. So really...
But what's a large, as I mentioned, in the United Kingdom, a large petition has been delivered, I believe, to the UK government. Are they responding to that? Are they listening to what the people are saying?
Yes, many NGOs like Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International, they signed a lot of petition. And they want to show that, you know, Israel and occupied Palestinian territories, Israel continues to impose institutional discrimination against Palestinians. But there must be political will also, because it is cumulative restrictions. Israel had parliamentary elections and new government came. So some analysts, they are saying that new government will be against even two-state solution. Mm-hmm. So I think Israel imposed lockdown, very eternal, very big lockdown to the people. So I think UK or big government, United States, they must follow those kind of actions.
Absolutely.
And
Elif, we're joined on the line from Gaza now by Akram Al-Satari, who's a news reporter and translator. Akram, thank you for joining us here again today on The Edge. If you stay with us, we're just going to look at a video together and then we'll be back to talk. More than 1,000 ultra-nationalist demonstrators bearing Israeli flags poured into East Jerusalem on Tuesday in a march aimed at provoking violence against its Palestinian populace.
Thousands of Israeli far-right nationalists marched in a flag-waving procession through occupied East Jerusalem on Tuesday, an event that reignited tensions with Palestinians and posed an early challenge to Israel's new government. Last month, Israeli-Palestinian confrontations in contested Jerusalem helped trigger 11 days of Israeli airstrikes in the Gaza Strip. Dozens of Palestinians were injured in clashes in the occupied territory, with Israeli police firing stun grenades.
This provocative march is the translation of occupation of East Jerusalem. They are creating eviction in Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan, and are organizing a march of provocation in Bab al-Amud here in Jerusalem. the only legitimate flag in East Jerusalem is the Palestinian flag. Other marches are provocation and should be stopped. The new government adopted the same decision of Benjamin Netanyahu. It seems that in these issues there is no change.
Israel, which occupied East Jerusalem in a 1967 war and later annexed it in a move that has not won international recognition, regards the entire city as its capital. Palestinians want East Jerusalem to be the capital of a future state that would include the West Bank and Gaza. Hamas had warned of renewed hostilities over the march, testing the mettle of new Prime Minister Naftali Bennett's administration of right-wing, centrist, left-wing and Arab parties, and prompting Israel to beef up its deployment of the Iron Dome anti-missile system. Yair Lapid, Bennett's foreign minister and main partner in the governing coalition that ended Benjamin Netanyahu's 12-year run as prime minister, condemned chants of death to the Arabs from some of the marchers.
Akram, it's just a matter of days now since the 11-day bombardment by Israel stopped. Yesterday, in response to the provocations from the Zionists in Jerusalem, Gaza itself protested, but Israeli again has been sending bombardments into Gaza. Do you fear that this could be the next step towards further attacks into the Gaza Strip from the Israeli military forces?
Well, yes, indeed. We are on the verge of a new round of escalation. And that new round of escalation is triggered by the activity of the settlers who are not only trying to demonstrate in the holy city of Al-Quds, Jerusalem, that is the second or the third sacred city for the Muslims all over the world, and the place that Palestinians see as their capital. They have also been insulting the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. They were also insulting Muslims and Arabs, which means they are using the name of Judaism for the sake of insulting other religions and mocking other religions. The way the people are acting, the way those demonstrators are acting, is showing the way they see the others, the way they see the Arabs, the way they see the Muslims, and the way they see the Arab world as animals, as people who are second-degree humans who don't deserve to live and who should be eradicated and killed. The slogans, "Death to Arabs," was chanted hundreds of thousands of times in that march. The 1,000 people who were gathering were showing to the world the real color of Zionism, the real perception of Zionists of the world, and they were vowing to eradicate the Palestinians and remove them from that holy land. All they have is hatred. All they have is extremism. All they have is aggression against other cultures, other religions, and other nations who were suffering from their aggression and hatred.
Do you see any in Gaza? As you're there, I want to. Is there any improvement in the situation since the last since the bombardments finished?
No improvement whatsoever in the situation. Israeli occupation still closes all the commercial crossings between Gaza and Palestine occupied 48. Israeli occupation is still banning the movement of the post services between Gaza and the West Bank, leading to the compiling of many passports, stockpiling of many passports that are waiting to be renewed. Israeli occupation is not allowing the needed number of Palestinian patients to move to the West Bank or Palestine occupied 48 to access the medical services. So in summary, the Israeli occupation is not allowing the life of the Palestinian that was already very devastated before the 11 days confrontation, is not allowing it to that level of devastation before the 11 days round of escalation. They're trying to push the Palestinians, they're trying to torment the Palestinians, they're trying to further besiege the Palestinians, and they're trying to make the Palestinians think twice before pointing a finger to the occupation. And the whole world is now watching with no single power, either big power like the EU or the USA or the Arab countries, or small powers like the ones in the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank can point a finger and ask the Israelis to stop that kind of collective punishment for the Palestinian people. And they are continuing to practice it the same way, and I think they'll continue to do that, and they'll continue to prevent the Palestinians from rebuilding their homes or rebuilding their lives as well.
The world is definitely watching. If the governments aren't doing anything, the people themselves must speak up. Ordinary people must speak up and tell their governments to take action. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. Akram Al-Satari, Elif Salim Chadik, thank you so much for joining me today here on The Edge. And such an important topic. Analysts from around the world have provided their insights into the situation in Palestine. Let's have a roundup of what they had to say. Israel has attacked Gaza yet again, technically breaking the ceasefire that was put in place earlier while Israeli far-right groups marched through occupied East Jerusalem in what's being described as a deliberate move to provoke Palestinians and increase tensions between Israelis and Palestinians. It seems as if the new government in Israel will follow the previous one's agenda. That's all for this episode of The Edge with me, Andy Boynes. Stay tuned. We'll be back tomorrow with more in-depth analysis on the top stories and a look beyond the edge.